Good morning, everyone, and welcome to China Goes Green book launch at Virtual American University. We'll be recording the webinar for future use, so I've been asked to request that you please do not record this session. That said, I am Jesse Rebo. I'm a professor at the School of International Service at American University. And today I'll be acting as host and moderator for this discussion with Yifei Li and Judith Shapiro, the authors of China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet. Yifei Li teaches environmental studies at NYU's Shanghai campus and is Global Network Assistant Professor at NYU. Yifei is also a residential fellow at the renowned Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. Judith Shapiro, like myself, is a professor at the School of International Service at American University, where she directs the Masters in Natural Resource and Sustainable Development program and is chair of the Global Environmental Politics program. Both authors have many other accolades. There's a lot more that could be said, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go directly to their timely and brilliant book. The book, China Goes Green, just published by Polity Press, is already getting very positive exposure in The Economist, in China Dialogue, and in Le Monde Diplomatique. China Dialogue called the book, quote, a cautionary tale on the consequences of coercive environmentalism, which the authors will be telling us more about. The Economist draws out the argument that, quote, China's rulers use greenery to cloak their long-standing authoritarian ambitions. And the Economist then concludes that China's leaders' green conscience is selective. They're quite critical then, that China performs environmentalism in some places while pillaging elsewhere. We'll see what the authors have to say about this. In brief, the book tells the story of the recent greening of China. It's the story of China taking a strong environmental stance, how China went from environmental villain to environmental defender. China Goes Green explores what it means when China's authoritarian government pursues and implements a policy that it calls ecological civilization. And I should say that this is a policy that in 2012, China inscribed in its very constitution. Very important. The book describes how, despite China's size and being one of the most intensely polluted places on the planet, as the authors have said in the book, China is making itself into a model of state-led environmentalism, a move which, as the authors write, quote, concentrates decisive political, economic, and epistemic power, I should say, over the environment, under centralized leadership. These are big issues. The authors ask whether this is, as it appears, a radical new approach to environmental governance. Is that what we're seeing? This launch is very timely because today, China committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. This is a great environmental step. It's one we should all applaud. And it's part of the backdrop that these authors are opening up for us and telling us about. So today we'll ask the authors how this new ecological civilization or authoritarian environmentalism is working and what it is doing for China's people, the nation of China, the world, and for environmentalism writ large. So for today's dialogue, I'll guide the discussion with the authors until 10:45 a.m., when we will open the floor to everyone attending for questions that you can submit via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. So please be thinking about what you would like to ask the authors of China Goes Green. Q&A will go from 10:45 to 11 a.m. when we will close the session. We have a little leeway at that time for people who'd like to continue, but I will mark that moment when it comes. Until then, let's turn to the authors, Yifei and Judith. Thank you, Yifei and Judith, for this incredibly timely, beautifully written and thorough book on the development and implications of China's authoritarian environmentalism. Tell us a little bit about how you two began to work together and what motivated the two of you to collaborate on this particular topic. What made this topic so important to you?
I could begin with sort of the first impetus that motivated us to write this book. But before that, thank you so much, Jesse, for your very, very generous introduction to the two of us and to the book itself. I think, one of the things that motivated us to write this book was our observation that in the West, there's an awful lot of frustration with democracies in terms of its inability to come up with effective and decisive solutions to the environmental problems in general and climate change in particular. I think, that frustration is being felt certainly in the United States, but by no means limited to the United States. Brexit came with it a host of environmental rollbacks in terms of the policies in that country. So that frustration, however, has led some observers and commentators and even scholars who work primarily on US environmental governance or European environmental governance to play with the idea of authoritarian approaches to environmental protection. There seems to be this speculation that if democracies can't cut it, why don't we look to China and see what they have accomplished? A lot of people point out China's plastic bag ban, which was indeed instituted almost overnight and has a measurable impact on the reductions of plastic waste. Other people point at China's renewable energy promotion policies, particularly looking at how the state in China was able to subsidize the renewable energy sector in a relatively short span of time and effectively grew that sector into the global leader in the transition into green economy. These and many other examples seem to have been repeated by many scholars and commentators as evidence of the quote unquote effectiveness or potential or hope, if you will, of authoritarian environmentalism, meaning using authoritarian means to accomplish environmental ends. We want to investigate that potential. We want to, in this book, systematically document various environmental initiatives in China from the industrial east of China to the borderlands in the west of the country to what China calls the Belt and Road Initiative, and then ultimately into the global commons. We want to see systematically whether the potential or the hope for using authoritarian means to accomplish environmental goals actually generated environmental benefits. And perhaps most importantly, we want to document what are the non-environmental consequences that have materialized along the way.
So I want to add my thanks to Jesse and to the School of International Service in general, which is my wonderful home. And I want to address Jesse's question about how we came to work together. And then I want to talk about a second impetus for writing the book, which very much motivated me. So Yifei and I met at a scholarly conference. We were on the panel together. And at that point, I was scheduled to go teach at Tsinghua University for a short-term gig at Schwarzman College. And Yifei was back in Shanghai, and we said, oh, well, you know, I'll have to have you come up, you'll have to come down, we'll give talks at each other's schools. And we began to understand that we've been working on this issue of environmental authoritarianism separately, but in a very congruent sort of way. And, you know, it evolved like that. And then we said, you know, I think we have a book here. Let's just do this thing. And so working together on the book was, I have to say, one of the nicest collaborative experiences I've ever had in my life. It was phenomenal. Yifei in China, I would go to sleep, I'd wake up, turn on the Google Doc, oh, Yifei's done all this great stuff, and then vice versa, yeah? So why did I want to do this book? I mean, yes, the frustration with democracy, the sense that, you know, we don't have any time left. Why can't we just ban plastic bags? Or a more recent bit of news, China has banned all those little plastic shampoo bottles you get in hotels. What a great idea. Let's just ban the damn things, right? So it looks very attractive. But I, for many, many decades even, have been watching what goes on in China's borderlands and generally working on human rights and intellectual freedom and public participation issues. And maybe about 15 years ago, started to hear the phrase ecological migration. I said, that sounds attractive. Let's all migrate for the sake of ecology, you know? But you dig in and you find out, oh, it's actually the state doing forcible relocations of Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongols. And basically the state, very James Scottish, the state implementing its control over its populace from the top down, but this time in the name of environmental protection. So they said, these nomads, their animals have these sharp little hooves and they're tearing up the grasslands. And so it's all the nomads' fault. So everybody move into the cities, you know, here's $10, have a nice life, right? And in the process, basically conducting a sort of cultural genocide, as the Dalai Lama has said about what goes on in Tibet. So when you extend that, and we, in the second chapter of the book where we write primarily about what's going on in the West, it also extends to a sort of green grabbing. So we all know about big dams and all of the forcible relocations that happen because of the big dams. Well, it's so much harder for people to resist those big dams if the state is able to say, well, we need this hydropower because it's part of this renewable energy mix that we've committed to achieving within a certain time frame. You know, it takes away the power of discourse from these vulnerable populations and who already felt pretty helpless against the state, but now you wrap it in green and it becomes even harder. So that was one of my primary motivations. So between the sort of international thing and then what's going on locally, I think we both felt that we really wanted to explore this. So I give a quick overview, if you don't mind. What we did, Yifei's already touched on this, but the book is in four parts, where we focus on the developed Eastern area, the less developed Western area, then the Belt and Road Initiative, and then even outer space, you know, and what they're doing with, I don't know, satellites and global data and all of that. So for each of those, we identified certain kinds of tools or techniques that the state used. And we won't go into all of them today, there isn't time, but for the East Coast, you know, it's campaigns and crackdowns and target setting, a very quantitative sort of approach, and behavior modification. And then for the West Coast, it's a one-size-fits-all green policymaking. And this gets into the afforestation issue. Okay, here's a map. You have to have a certain number of trees there before next year, or you local official are going to be in trouble, right? So this kind of quantitative target setting, which is fine, except that it often catches vulnerable and innocent people in the net. And then the ecological migration that I also mentioned. And for the rest, I won't go through all of them, but you know, the green export of green technocracy and engineering China's atmosphere, and then even conducting what we're calling outer space environmentalism. Now, one story that blew my mind, I didn't know before researching this book, is China is actively trying to change the weather on the Tibetan Plateau by shooting a bunch of particles into the air, monitoring when the monsoons are coming, shooting the particles into the air, and actively creating more rain in Tibet, because they know that with climate change and glacier melt, they need to try to keep these watersheds alive. So some pretty wild stuff is going on in the name of the environment.
Yeah, that geoengineering is quite frightening. You're talking about a situation, coercive environmentalism, which has an attractive side, if it is successful, of conserving the environment, and has, of course, a horrifying side of being imposed and having negative effects for particular groups and populations, and for popular participation and control, people's self-determination in various ways, right? But what I hear is this brings a kind of question about what is better, an authoritarian regime or democracy for the environment. And it's got some real big moral hazards in each camp. Obviously, democracies can also ban things via representation. Legislatures can decide to ban things. So there is a confusion in democracy of pushing toward markets to do everything, but markets can also be very coercive, green grabs, and exclusion of the poor. How are you working in your thinking? How is your thinking developed around this balance of when authoritarianism actually works? Is it good? Where is it really, where are the shortcomings? What is the balance that we might seek in this arena?
That's a really good question, Jesse. I think, the book itself is premised on many, many case studies. In each of the chapters, we provide detailed investigations into very concrete cases. And towards the end, in the conclusion, what we try to do is to take stock of these cases. And like you described, we try to understand what exactly are the conditions that enable the kind of decisive state leadership in China to achieve good environmental outcomes, but also what are the conditions under which decisive state leadership turned out not to work the way it wanted to or the way it claimed to.
Can you give some examples?
Sure.
Wonderful.
Yeah, sure. The kind of cases that we documented really were, if you will, positive cases, were cases where environmental journalists were participating in the policymaking process. Their voices were heard and accounted for by state officials. Environmental documentary filmmakers spent years and years documenting trash problems, pollution on the Tibetan Plateau, and various polluters in the industrial east of China and in the western underdeveloped areas of China. And then these documentary films garnered global attention, and the sustained global attention pressured Chinese government actors to actually pay attention to these cases that are documented in these films, and also scientists who contributed their knowledge, independent scientists who have been studying issues about hydropower for decades, when their voices are heard by the state. And then the state has the tendency to create policies that are not only decisive, but are also sensitive to the needs of the people, sensitive to the complexity of the scientific matters that are the core of environmental policies, and sensitive to the various groups of people whose livelihoods are affected or will be affected by the implementation of environmental policies. So our argument towards the end of the book really is that when the state opens itself up to voices from the society, whether it's citizen groups, scientists, or journalists, or what have you, they then become much more effective in their development of environmental policies. Whereas if the state closes itself off from all these other actors, then the chances are that state power goes awry in many of the other quote unquote negative cases that we documented in this book.
Yeah, if I can add one thing, one of the structural problems that we found over and over again is that local officials are judged by their performance in meeting certain targets, and they're always looking upwards for approval. They're not looking downwards. In Maoist thought, they talk about supervision by the masses, and yet in some ways the party has really lost sight of that. So we even saw this with the COVID issue, right? Because initially, local officials were afraid to tell their superiors in Wuhan that they had this problem, and they suppressed the information. So it got out. So COVID got out. The information eventually got out with the help of bloggers who were then put in jail, and doctors who tried to warn the world and were suppressed, and so on. So in the book, the two of my, one of my favorite examples is there was an air pollution target set throughout the country. And in Hunan province, when they were threshing their grain, the grain in the air gave these artificially high spikes in pollution readings. And so the local officials, out of fear of not meeting targets, banned the use of these threshing machines, and this villages lost their entire grain harvest as a result. So, they sort of realized that, they corrected that later, but, this is an example. Or another example was there were a certain number of wastewater treatment plants that were supposed to be built within a short period of time, and they were built, but they weren't connected. And so, a year or two later, they found that they were basically not being used at all, right? So this is the kind of, attention to targets. I was thinking about, how to bring this home, and there's a paragraph, I won't read the whole thing, but there's a paragraph in our book that gives an example of the flavor of this sort of target setting. And so they say there's a certain percentage of days in a year when air quality must be at least good, should be 80%. The forest cover rate should be at least 23.04%. The grassland vegetation cover should be 56%. The percentage of national key protected wild animals under protection, at least 95%. So these are these very numerically based sorts of things that, sometimes it doesn't make sense in the implementation. And this is what we worry about. We're talking about the carbon neutrality by 2060, which sounds fantastic, but here comes a whole lot more quantitative targets. Here come a whole lot more renewable hydropower dams. And then when we also think about how they're going carbon neutral, are they measuring China's global impact, where along the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a lot of overcapacity in building coal-fired power plants. So many of those coal-fired power plant technologies and experts have gone overseas to build them in places as far-flung as Jamaica, So the environmental footprint of, China's carbon, really, to be fair, has to look at the global impact and not just what goes on within China's borders.
This seems to me to be the crux of a big set of issues. The China Famine under Mao, where I think some 30 million people died, as recorded in the book Tombstone, was in fact all about this upward communication where people were trying to meet quotas and therefore took grain away from the hungry. Those kinds of things happen. But in modern day China, where I have visited a number of times, China Agricultural University, I'm impressed with the degree to which the government is soliciting and seeking information and trying to be informed. And I know there are many fora for public participation. Now, this is an interesting issue. To what degree is that public participation effective? How in China is there downward accountability, as it were, of the leaders to these needs, aspirations, and the complexity and diversity of situations on the ground that cannot, in fact, sustain such an imposed kind of uniform set of policies? There needs to be that differentiating through voice in some way. How is that evolving and under the greening of China?
What you just said, Jesse, reminded me of an example in the book in which we discussed how in the province of Jiangsu, which is not too far away from where I am in Shanghai, the provincial government developed an app that everybody can download if you go to the App Store. It has a funny name. It's called Smelly and Black Water or something to that effect. What that app enabled the user to do is that if any user anywhere in the province of Jiangsu see a polluted river or just a polluted body of water, they can just take a picture of that place, upload it through the app, and georeference exactly where they took the picture. That would be evidence for the local authorities to actually come out to this particular spot and be able to identify the polluters who were at the time emitting pollutants into the river. And that seems to me is just a perfect example of how the state can effectively utilize what effectively is a crowdsourced mechanism for environmental enforcement. It will be, incredibly costly if the state decided to take it all on themselves. It simply would not be possible for them to have that many enforcers to go out to the, to the entire province to collect evidence of pollution. But through individual citizens and people who care about their own neighborhoods, their own communities, and the well-being of the people, people are willing to help the state to enforce these environmental rules and regulations more effectively. And that's just one of the examples, like you described, that many of the state actors seems to want that input, but the real difficulty seems to how to get that input and how to account for these various inputs in the policymaking process and give these inputs a proper place in Chinese policymaking.
If I can add just a little tiny bit of historical perspective, and not deep history, recent history. Starting in the 1980s, there was this amazing burgeoning of space for civil society. And the 80s are considered a golden decade of sort of freedom. Then Tiananmen massacre occurred in 89, a big closing down. But still during the 90s, especially in the environmental area, the NGOs seem to enjoy quite an interesting amount of freedom. And I have some writings about it separate from this book, exploring all different sorts of techniques, many of them normally available to Western NGOs, like naming and shaming and symbolic politics, a lot of Greenpeace type bearing witness actions. And there was a sort of a special relationship that the civil society groups had with the parts of the government that were trying to implement environmental protection, because they knew if they didn't, they were going to lose even more legitimacy in the eyes of the people who were, rising middle class and really tired of dying of cancer and being afraid of what they could eat and what they could drink and what they could breathe, right? So there's a reason that the state is so concerned about these issues. But yeah, the 90s were really, kind of an exciting time. And then under Xi Jinping, there's been a steady narrowing of space for freedom of speech, for freedom of assembly, for organizing of all different kinds. New NGO laws have been passed that really restrict foreign NGOs, both environmental NGOs and basically development NGOs from free activity. In some ways, the domestic NGOs have a different type of freedom than they did before, but they're very much monitored by the state. They must cooperate with the state. They must have chats on a regular basis with the Public Security Bureau to tell the Public Security Bureau what they're up to. And they can get shut down at a moment's notice. The state loves to cast aspersions on people's moral behavior, right? So for example, Chai Jing, the journalist who created Under the Dome, immediately after the state decided they didn't like her documentary after all, they started rumoring about her ethical behavior. And same thing, another famous NGO, the guy was accused of, molesting young girls or something. But this is which is not to say that that's not a very serious issue. But I don't know if he did though, they use that as a way to clamp down on people. Yeah. So
Yeah.
right now, it's not as good a time as it was even 10 years ago for environmental groups.
And if I could just add to that real quickly, one of the things that we think is on the rise, particularly in environmental governance in China, is the increasing use of war discourses, war rhetoric, in describing pollution or environmental policies. You know, wars on pollution, a battle against water pollution. And these things almost come out weekly, if not more frequently, by various government bodies within China. Now, on the one hand, these war discourses seem to suggest a certain level of decisiveness, but at the same time, under that particular discourse, officials seem to feel that they are empowered to do a lot of things that are not exactly due process. That seems to have, you know, the war rhetoric seems to have empowered these low-level officials to crack down on pollution, to force closures of factories without any particular legal basis, or even forcing citizens to adopt a desired behavioral modification according to the state without consulting the citizens. I think, you know, that rise in war rhetoric is a worrying sign, and we need to pay attention to a lot of the shrinking civil space, the shrinking extent of engagement and participation in the environmental realm in particular.
Yeah. Yifei, maybe you can tell about what it was like for the people of Shanghai when the recycling regulations were instituted and the use of social credit scores on that. That's a really interesting story.
Yeah, and you know, there are numerous pieces to Shanghai's recycling mandate, which came out last year, I believe July the 1st. You know, part of the program actually instituted what they called garbage inspectors as a mechanism for each residential neighborhood. There would be one or two, or sometimes even three retirees from that neighborhood. They would just stand right next to the garbage can. If you want to dispose of a bag, they would demand to see what's inside. And they will want to tell you if you are sorting your recyclables from non-recyclables, or if you're doing it correctly or not. And there are also designated hours in which you can dispose of trash that usually materializes in the form of 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. If you can't make it to that, within that window to go back home and go throw your trash, then you can't. You essentially will be illegally dumping trash in your residential neighborhood. And in fact, when I talked to some of these quote unquote garbage inspectors, they even told me that they, at the time, were imagining a future where each of these garbage cans would be equipped with facial recognition technologies, so that their jobs would be obsolete, but they were envisioning what they described as quote unquote an orderly future. Now that was discussions that I had back last year. What we learned just a couple of weeks ago was that these facial recognition technology enabled trash cans became a reality, has already become a functional device in some of the neighborhoods in the city of Beijing. I have not seen these devices firsthand, but I've seen plenty of reports about them.
Our own law and order president would like to see himself as a COVID wartime president. So the discourse of war enables the use of coercive powers. He is not, in fact, taking action on COVID, but would like the credit of the kind of fighting a battle that justifies excessive power. I see that it appears that the state, the government in China, on the environmental front is well-intentioned in some ways, in many ways, perhaps not in all ways. Can you speak a little bit to that? So how much of China's greening is performance on a global stage or even a national stage? And why would China's government want to do this in terms of performance, if that's in fact what they're doing?
Let me start just from the domestic point of view. I already mentioned that the citizenry is sick and tired of living in this polluted environment. So there is a legitimacy problem for the state if they don't deal with that problem.
So they're listening to the people on that.
Well, there's what they call environmental mass incidents, on a very, very regular basis where people are striking or even shutting down cities because of certain kinds of pollution events or like a PX plant being built or whatever. The second thing to note is that I always have students say, I want to write a book about, or an article or a paper about the climate change movement in China. And it's not so much a movement in China at this point. There's one girl who's gotten a lot of press because she's copying Greta Thunberg. But basically, the urgency is much more about ground level pollution and food. The heavy metals in food, really, really bad. So anyway, but the state has a longer view. China has the beauty of really being able to plan ahead. And the government understands very fully that climate change is a huge threat to the security of the country. Whether it's, we already mentioned a little bit about the Tibetan Plateau and the weather there, but the glaciers are melting and there may be floods. There were terrible rains this past summer. There was some talk about whether the Three Gorges Dam would be able to hold. So these extreme weather events, plus the glacier melt, the falling aquifers, all of these things are really serious security challenges. Where Yifei lives in Shanghai, the sea level is rising. We got a future Venice on our hands in Shanghai. So the state understands the importance of dealing with climate change, and they deal with it a double win, they call it. So by dealing with ground level pollution, they're often able at the same time to reduce their carbon output. So a lot of what they were going to do with climate change has also to do with these other sorts of pollutions. So then to this other question, maybe I've talked too long, let Yifei talk about what China has to gain on the global stage by assuming the green mantle.
Yeah, great points, Judy. The stuff I always think back to when it comes to China's global ambitions is in fact what happens domestically in China with planting trees. That's a primary example that we documented in, I believe, chapter 2 of the book, where we look at the reasons why China has invested so aggressively in planting trees. And most importantly, what kind of trees are they planting and why are they planting these particular trees in these particular locations? Well, Chinese top policy makers are indeed, Jesse, like you suggested, very, very concerned with many of these environmental problems that the country has to deal with now and will have to deal with in the future. They're not insensitive to these challenges and they want to do something. Our discussion in the book, however, suggests that sometimes they want to do things too badly. There's a haste to want to make environmental gains immediately. There seems to be not enough patience for genuine environmental sustainability, which doesn't usually come overnight. One of the cases that we document was the rehabilitation of the Loess Plateau, which in fact, even before the project did anything to the landscape, the local government officials, in collaboration with scientists, both from within China and from outside China, collaborated for 2 years just to do community surveys, to try to understand people's livelihoods on the Loess Plateau, and to bring in ecologists and sociologists and economists and hydrologists to understand what could be a comprehensive model that they could pilot on the Loess Plateau. And that was hugely successful, but it was only successful because the state had the patience to wait for 2 years before they implemented anything. They weren't any less decisive. Once again, we praised the decisiveness once they figured out a model. They poured in political and financial resources to make the pilot work. However, what we're increasingly seeing is an urge on the part of state actors to quickly replicate these models Well, once you want to go too quickly, we're seeing that they're planting lots and lots of monocultural forests that may have the temporary effect of looking like a forest, but within 2 years, or sometimes even shorter, these poplar monocultural forests end up sucking all of the underground water from what was left in the way of underground water, and in the end, worsening the problems of desertification. So I think, you know, China, in doing that, wanted to bill itself as this civilizational leader in global sustainability. When top policymakers use this notion of ecological civilization, there seems to be a rather strong imperative to suggest that the rise of China is not just economical, is not just cultural, but also in some fundamental ways civilizational. And this civilization seems to be green, seems to be historically rooted, seems to be economically powerful. Now, that global ambition also materializes on the Belt and Road and into the global commons. We see that when China tries to export a lot of what China calls green technologies to its Belt and Road partner countries, they're very much adopting the same frame of mind of exporting Chinese influence, of exporting Chinese soft power. They're unapologetic about that. A lot of these projects are just explicitly marketed as soft power projects. A lot of these geopolitical ambitions, in other words, seem to have been wrapped with a green cloak. That strikes us as a common pattern of a lot of these global ambitions of Chinese environmentalism by the state actors.
Right, a kind of greenwashing. Judith.
Judy, you're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, my husband was coughing. One last just note about what China has to gain by positioning itself as a global leader in the environment is that it's kind of a counterbalance to some of the negative publicity that it's getting with respect to its suppression of people in Xinjiang and Tibet, with respect to its actions in the South China Sea, with its overall human rights record, and so on and so forth. To be able to hold itself up as like a good guy on this issue, especially at a moment when the US, I don't know, I think our power status is not just kind of receding, it's like tumbling and falling off the cliff. So China's the new superpower, and to an extent, you know, they're gradually learning to assume some responsibilities associated with that.
Yeah. So in your comments, what I can see, and in the book, is that there really are effective processes of public review, but that this upward look of local administrators is still potentially very damaging and makes the coercion, as you call it, problematic. Because in fact, we would even be able to ask, what is the distinction between the enforcement of a law and what is being called imposition and coercion? It's that the law wasn't necessarily made in the same way, but there is imposition in either system. What I wanted to ask is, given the positive elements and some of the negative elements of this greening, of this revolution, as it were, that China is presenting as its objective and in some of its policies, how do you move forward? What do you encourage and what do you discourage China to do and people outside of China to do, such that China will continue the more progressive elements of this policy?
That's a really wonderful question, Jesse. One of the things we try to argue in multiple places in the book is that China doesn't need to look beyond its own political history. When the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, even before the founding of the country, it was very clear that Mao and his inner circles designed a political system that had a very important component that they called political consultations. The idea being that, well, the Communist Party is the ruler, is the ruling party, and it wants to remain to be the ruling party over the long haul. However, in order to avoid the single party system, to make errors, to do things that aren't necessarily sensible from the perspective of other groups. The party system was designed to have a political consultation process where top party leaders are expected to consult with scientists, doctors, journalists, college professors, even students and NGOs in general, in various groups within society, simply for sake of making sure that state power is not unchecked, to make sure that the state remains in touch with the diverse population of China and the diverse landscape of the country, and the vast landscape of the country as well. You know, we aren't by any means suggesting that China needs to adopt any kind of US style or European style democratic system. All we're suggesting is that if China goes back and tries to revive that system of political consultation, it could do very well. That system has a track record of great success within China. What we're documenting is that the political consultation mechanisms are being sidelined and marginalized over these past few decades. What we're advocating for is the revival, and genuine revival of the political consultations.
Okay, very good. It is time to move to Q&A and to invite the audience into the discussion. So please do post your comments in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And obviously we won't get to all of them, but let me start. I see there's one from Jean Mayer. Do you see the comments, by the way? I'm not sure.
We do.
It's not exactly asking a question, but it basically says, I recently watched an Al Jazeera report about dirty secrets of green energy. The idea being that we're replacing one polluting source of fossil fuels for another polluting source of rare earths. Automobile makers and others are demanding these rare earths. And the founder of the Rainforest Action Network comments on this at the end, that the real problem is economic growth and the other demand of the over demand for goods. So in a sense, is there something to do about this economic growth part of the problem? I think would be a way to make that into a question. And this over demand, and what is China's role in that?
That's a really fascinating question, and there are so many layers to it. I think on the one hand, there's global consumption, there's global demand for all of these products that are still made in China. And you know, we can talk about China's ecological footprint and China's global ecological footprint, but we also have to bear in mind that a significant proportion of products that are made in China are by no means consumed in China. So I think the listener makes a great point, which is that if we don't tackle the consumption side of things, there's really no easy solution out of any of this.
Judith, did you want to?
No, I want to see, I think Paul Wapner and Tammy Guttner have questions.
Okay, yeah, I will move on to those. Should I read them? I don't know if the audience...
No, I think we can summarize them, or you can summarize them.
Well, I have to read them first. But okay, Yifei mentioned, Paul Wapner says that Yifei mentioned a case of state offering an app for the citizens to report cases of water pollution. Well, what happens once the cases are reported? What is the process after that, and what are some of the vicissitudes of this type of an app?
That's a very good question, Paul. Thanks for the question. What essentially happens is if a citizen, any citizen, submits a report through the app, someone within the government actually is obliged to respond to that query. If there is confirmed evidence, then they will take action, and they will actually notify the citizen of the specific actions that have been taken. Or if there's no action taken, then they will actually give reasons as to why they didn't pursue the cases any further. There's a built-in mechanism for the state to respond to each and every case that was brought to them. As to whether there could be a systematic bias in the kind of cases that they choose to deal with more aggressively, we don't know yet. There's not enough sufficient evidence to address that question, though I know that some of the environmental economists out at Nanjing University, I don't know if any of them are on this webinar, but I do know a few colleagues who are working with Jiangsu Environmental Protection Ministries to actually gather systematic data to be able to address precisely that question. Now, to my knowledge, the Jiangsu government has been completely transparent about their data on this particular app, which I think is an extremely welcoming sign.
So there's a question by Tamar Gutner, who congratulates the authors on untangling the nuances of the situation of authoritarianism in green clothing and how that works. Tamar asks, will people in China be able to read the book? Will its message make its way there? Is there any risk to you as scholars? Wonderful question.
Yeah, great question. Tammy, I am physically located in the city of Shanghai, and here's a copy of our book. So to your question, yes, we did manage to get copies of the book into China, and the Kindle version of the book is available to anyone anywhere in the world, so long as they have the internet. So the hope obviously is for more people in this country to be able to read our book. Are there political risks as scholars? I guess a short answer is I don't know.
Okay.
So people, oopsie, am I
Go ahead.
again? Yeah, people are always asking me about that for me because my work got a lot of work by now, you know, and a lot of it has been pretty critical of the government. So far, so good. And I think it's because we do give credit where credit is due. We don't have some kind of, I don't know, agenda of revenge or, you know, we're not trying, thank you. We're not trying to, you know, topple a system, but we want to see, you know, what is the system doing well and what are the problems? And certainly, I mean, Yifei's lived his whole life, well, except for his studies in the US, in China. I've been back and forth to China for 40 years now, something like that. I know a lot of victims, you know, I know a lot of people who have suffered under the system because they were caught up in some campaign or other and had no redress. And so this informs a lot of my work. And as I said in the opening, the fact that environmental protection is being used in some of this repression is a particularly problematic to me personally. But I would like to see this book read in China, or at least maybe it will be read internally. I know Yifei's been a little careful about the publicity in Chinese because he doesn't want pieces of the book to be taken out of context. So we'll see. Yeah, Yifei is of course a Chinese passport holder. He doesn't have citizenship anywhere else. And I, thanks to coronavirus, have no plans to visit China anytime soon, so yeah.
Right. I want to just interject another question in here, and that is, it almost sounds like it's a system that actually has quite a few good intentions, but is structurally problematic in the relation between the state and the people in terms of that kind of responsiveness and public leverage within and communication to the state. Is that really where the problem lies?
I think that's where part of the problem lies. I completely agree with you, Jesse, that there are plenty of people who work as state actors in China who are well-intended, who really genuinely are committed to doing something for the environment or for their community or for economic development, what have you. However, one of the things which Judy and I have both touched on already is this issue of these quantitative targets. A lot of these officials actually feel that they're trapped by these targets that are assigned to them. It's not like they have the leeway to pursue the full extent of the policies that they see merits in, right? They see all of these, indeed. When they have to hit these targets, and when these targets are not designed by people who have intimate knowledge of the local settings, and yet local officials are obliged to comply with these orders coming from far away, they sometimes feel that their hands are tied. So you're absolutely right that governing a country the size of China and as complex as China and as populous as China has its unique set of challenges. We're by no means diminishing these challenges, and we're also not unseeing the good intentions that we have seen in our own field work, in our own interactions with various people. I admire some of their commitments, and yet, like you pointed out, the structural problems are not going away. And part of the goal of this book, I think, is for Judy and I to articulate where exactly are these structural problems at each level. How do these structural problems play out? Because if you don't understand the exact places where they go wrong, then there can't be a good remedy to that problem.
We have another question from Sarah Elizabeth Bellamar. What parallels and differences exist between contemporary green authoritarianism in contemporary China and conservationist policies in the USSR, fascist states, etc.? Is this era of green authoritarianism fundamentally different from previous states that also employed green rhetoric in their policies?
Yeah. I actually think that's a great question, but I want to take it in a little bit different direction. There are parallels between what China is doing and what some so-called democratic societies are doing with conservation in some parts of the developing world, whether you're talking about Red Plus, which often ends up basically depriving indigenous people and local people of their access to resources because this money is coming from outside and saying you can't go in anymore, where you're not allowed to touch those trees, or fortress conservation models that are implemented in parts of Africa, where again, people are displaced. And I've heard, I haven't been in Africa, Jesse's have been in Africa, but I've heard that sometimes the local people are so angry that they'll even go out of their way to kill the endangered creatures that are intended to be protected because they're so angry about
as an act of resistance.
Yeah, as an act of resistance. So I think the tendency of coercive environmentalism to be associated not only with Stalin-rooted states, but really throughout the world is one that really have to pay attention to. And we have several pages in the book where we make that comparison and say, look, we're not only talking about China, we're talking about this tendency everywhere not to engage the people. If the people are not involved in conservation or other kinds of environmental protection efforts, in the long run, they're going to fail. You can implement them in a draconian way, in a campaign style for a couple of months, couple of weeks, sweep everybody up in that. But in the long run, if there isn't public support for it, it's not going to work. So
absolutely. From the early work of Nancy Peluso in Kenya on coercive conservation, which was and has been and still is implemented by U.S. International Development Agency, many international environmental NGOs, and is imposed and authoritarian. So it is not the unique domain of national governments who claim to be, who do not claim to be democratic, but have other systems. Okay, it is now actually 11 o'clock. We are officially done with this book launch. I want to thank Judith and Yifei for a terrific discussion and the audience for great questions. We'll stay after for a second for the last question that's on the list, but I just wanted to say thank you to all and ask you what your last words would be, since others might have to leave.
Yeah, I have a last word. I just scanned down the participant list and I understand why we have to do it this way, but I wish you could all see each other because, you know, for me, all people from all different parts of my life are here, current students, prior students, alumni, fellow faculty members, people I know from Schwartzman College, you know, big shout out to Diana Piloyan in Mexico. You know, I wish that you could all sense the connection that an event like this helps to create, because it's really very meaningful. Thank you for all for being here. My sister's here too. Hi, Ellen.
Would you like to say a closing remark of any sort?
Yeah, sure. If I could just say that I want to be absolutely clear that this book is not an attempt to take sides. We certainly don't want to contribute to more of the Chinese propagandists' view of China being the model of ecological civilization. And at the same time, we disagree with some people who suggest that China is the engine of global environmental catastrophe. What we try to do is to say that there's a lot of nuance in what we are observing. And we do need to give China credit where credit is due. But at the same time, there's always a yes, but statement in each of the cases that we document. And I think that the point is really for us to articulate these yes, but statements, which is true about China, which I think is true about any empirical context that we study. I just want to end at that.
Very good. So thank you all for the audience, for coming and joining us. And very quickly and informally, now that the session is officially closed, the last question from Ralph H. Lutz is, there's a good deal of citizen science going on in the US and elsewhere, including water quality monitoring and other approaches to studying indicators of environmental quality. But this doesn't seem to reach the level of citizen surveillance and communication with authorities you describe in China. Have you given thought to what might be done to usefully take some of the citizen science to the next reasonable level of partnership with authorities? I guess you're referring to in the US and outside of China.
I think because there are so few avenues of engagement available to people in China, when they open up, people are quick to jump on. And really, you know, the level of, you mentioned earlier the Economist column, which we were really happy to see. And in the Economist column, he profiles David Rennie, the author, profiles trash pickup kind of a NGO. And Yifei was just saying that since that Economist column has come out, the membership in that NGO, the number of volunteers has just skyrocketed. So, you know, I think that in the US, we're spoiled, you know, we think that somebody else will take care of it. There's this mattress dumped under the bridge on the entrance to my park down here. And I keep thinking, why doesn't somebody do something about that? And I tried to call the city and get bulk pickup. You know, everybody assumes somebody else will take care of it because we're sort of, you know, we think, but I think in China, you know, that's one of China's great strengths too. You know, it's its people and their willingness to step up. I don't know how you change that culture in the US.
So are those new members in China?
I haven't asked specifically about that, but I presume because all of their volunteer activities are within China on the east coast of the country.
Yeah, and that's an interesting fact if that's the case, because it shows that unlike what many Americans might think, people in China are reading The Economist and do have access to all kinds of information, although there are restrictions as well. Anyhow, thank you both for a terrific session. Thank you to everyone who has stayed with us in this post-session moment. And good day. Enjoy the rest of your day.